So today we're going to be talking about assessment. What is assessment? Viewing assessment, different examples of assessment. So first we have the broad definition. In education, the term assessment refers to the wide variety of methods or tools that educators use to evaluate, measure, and document the academic readiness, learning progress, skill acquisition, or educational needs of students. Now, there's a lot to break down in that sentence, a little bit of a run on sentence as well, that provides a lot of information. So, first, we want to highlight this word variety here because I feel that in education, a lot of people may think of assessment, immediately think of a test or a quiz and nothing else. And when you take a deeper dive into assessment, you see that there is a great variety and that there are many things and many different ways that you can assess. And we will be diving into that later on in the slide presentation. We also need to look at evaluate, measure, and document. I think that's important because not only are we evaluating, measuring, and documenting these things that it lists and the progress of the students and the educational needs of the students, we also need to be evaluating and measuring ourselves. If 75% of the class fails the assessment, it's not because 75% of the class just is completely unaware of what's going on and not smart and they don't get it and you just need to move on. It's probably because you didn't do something right. And so when you're looking at assessment, it's really important that you evaluate yourself as well, because you can learn a lot about yourself and how you're lecturing and how you're teaching to provide the best opportunity for these students to pass the tests and or the other assessments that you're giving them. So now we look at examples of testing. Testing, obviously, questions in the classroom, homework, placement assessments. There's all sorts of examples that I could give. Those are just four main ones that we'll talk about. And then we come over here to the right side and we talk about formative versus summative. So formative assessments show what a student is learning throughout the course, unit, or lesson, whereas a summative assessment shows what a student learned after a course, unit, or lesson. So for example, formative assessments may look like a middle of the unit quiz, questions in the classroom throughout the lecture just to see where the class is at, or even exit tickets where you can't leave the classroom until you provide the answer to a question on a note card. All these are assessments that allow you to track the progress of your students and see how it's going without just giving one big exam. And then you have the summative assessment, which is at the end of the course or unit, which is your big exam, your test, and there are a lot less options for summative assessments than formative. There are many things you can do with formative assessments, very few you can do with summatives. Oftentimes, 99% of the time, you're going to see those as tests or exams. Occasionally, maybe a big essay. Now we look at how are these forms of assessment useful. So first off, you know where your students are at. You're getting almost immediate feedback of how your students are doing. Sometimes I pause there for a second because I guess sometimes it can be some extended feedback, some later on feedback if you're grading and it takes a while. But for the most part, you're getting pretty immediate feedback. Like I touched on earlier, you're evaluating yourself. You're seeing what you're doing right, seeing what you're doing wrong. I mean, it's okay to pat yourself on the back, but it's also okay to recognize that you may be doing something wrong and change it in the next unit. And then you can kind of evaluate what the classroom's next is. And I put that next in quotations just so you guys will know that I'm going to better explain that if you don't exactly know what that means. But that means, what are we doing next as far as a unit or a lesson? Like, I know this might be the next unit in the syllabus or whatever, but my class didn't understand this past unit at all. And if they didn't understand this past unit, they're not going to understand this next one. So you may have to shift the next of the class. You may have to shift to something a little more easier to help the students get it. And then you go back to what was next. So I believe that that's kind of what evaluating the classroom's next is obviously you want to stay on par with the curriculum, but every once in a while you may have to veer off just a second to make sure everyone in the classroom is on the same page and developing. And then lastly, I put develop consistency. And kind of what I mean by that is you could have formative assessments, quizzes on Wednesday, exit tickets on Thursday, tests always on the second Friday, because a unit's usually 2 weeks long, maybe 7 to 10 days. It develops a consistency. The class knows what to expect. They're more likely to get into a routine, a rhythm to prepare. If they know their quiz is always on Wednesday, eventually that's going to ingrain in their head that they need to prepare for that quiz on Wednesday. Versus if there's always different things bouncing around, then they're not always prepared. And that isn't me saying that you always have to have a test on Wednesday or a quiz on Wednesday or an exit take. It doesn't have to be that consistent, but it's definitely an idea and definitely something that may be useful in the classroom for forms of assessment. And then lastly, here we're going to look at limitations. So the limitations of assessment, obviously you have cheating. That's always possible though, no matter what. But in assessment, I mean, you are going to have those issues. If you have tests online, sometimes students can use online to find the answers. If you have tests on paper, sometimes students can use their neighbor. I mean, that's always going to be probably prominent in the classroom. You can only do your best to eliminate it. Lengthy grading time, if you're not using an online source, or if it's short answer responses on an online source, or an essay assessment, that will provide lengthy grading time, not because you're putting it off, but because you're going to be busy. You're going to have classes, you're going to have a family, you have things to do. It's not like you just are always going to have 7 hours after school to sit down before bed and grade. So that lengthy grading time can then result in getting feedback later to students, which they may struggle with because then they don't have as much time to prepare for the big exam. So that's definitely a limitation. And lastly, you just have students who naturally struggle on assessments. There will be students in your classroom that are rock stars. There will be students in your classroom that really do understand material and really are smart, but they just struggle when it comes to the assessment. And sometimes you're going to have to figure that out with your students, and you're going to have to see whether that's a listening issue, a paying attention issue, or if they really just do struggle on assessments. And it's on you as a teacher to make sure that you figure out who those students are, because you don't want to just constantly penalize them if they're struggling on assessments, but they really are smart. And I think that's something that you just have to work with your colleagues on if they've had that student before, and just kind of develop a good understanding. But that would kind of be the last limitation that we'll talk about. And then right here, I just have my sources that I use to get some information on formative and summative assessments and a couple other things that I talked about in this